So what I'd like to talk about today is a topic that has research about medical providers that do not provide interpreters. It's not that we're looking at that as much as we do hear these complaints. That it's not that they don't necessarily want to, but the fact that the interpreter service itself is costly. And so that's what I'd like to take a deeper look at. Because I want people in the audience to understand that it's possible that providers have never experienced working with a deaf person before in their lives, and really perhaps have not even met a deaf person. And so in opening, I'd like to start with some information that supports that. So let's talk about the demographics of deaf people. That's what we're going to talk about today. We're going to talk about interpreting, not at a college level, so we'll call it interpreting 050, just barely scratching that surface. But then also, we're going to talk about what undue hardship is and what it means when people say that the service is too expensive. So some of the numbers that I'm going to be giving you at this point are not numbers that are hard and fast. It is really, in many cases, educated guesses with research behind them. So when we start that, it is that it's about 2 to 3 out of every 1,000 children in the United States that are born with a detectable level of hearing loss in one or both ears. And in the larger group of society, American adults, 15% of those people have some level of difficulty hearing that they report. Now, we're going to talk specifically about Idaho. And for our purposes, an estimate of about 1.7 million people have a hearing loss. And that number comes to us as recently as July of 2018. Out of that 1.7 million people, 25% of those are children. And when you break that down further, because of that 2 to 3 out of 1,000 number, you're talking about 1,300 or so children who are born with some level of hearing loss. Now, that number doesn't include the largest numbers of people who have hearing loss, which is a group of people who get that later on in life. There's groups of people who have hearing loss because of the onset of an illness. There's also people who have a hearing loss that begins at puberty. The Idaho Educational Services for the Deaf and Blind collects data of those who qualify from ages 0 to 24 years of age. And their hearing loss is such that it requires additional levels of support. So there's a severity factor in the reporting as well. Now, from those numbers, you might see that there's a larger percentage that seems to come up after the age of 18. And so we have that 15% number of people who have a hearing loss that are not in the group of children. So you're talking about 200,000 people of adult age that have some level of hearing loss. The causes vary widely. Sometimes it's occupational exposure to noise that damages their hearing. Sometimes there are ototoxic medications. And then there is natural progression due to age in hearing loss at times. There are hearing loss as a result of traumatic brain injuries or other specific diseases or conditions that can cause that. Thanks. And so the point of that is if you are working with children, and if there is a group of, so for example, 200 children that you work with, one of those children will have a hearing loss. Now, if you're working with the adult population in your practice, for each 7 patients that you have, one of those will have a hearing loss. So that's the demographics and the numbers that you're going to be seeing. So when you're in a service provider industry, which healthcare, of course, is, you are going to encounter individuals who have some level of hearing loss during the time of your practice. And you can assume that is going to happen, even if in your past experience that has not been the case. You will encounter people that have a hearing loss, regardless of whether you have or not in the past. There are some other groups of people that you're going to encounter that I haven't mentioned in great depth yet. Individuals with speech disorders, for example, or also individuals who have intellectual or developmental disabilities. These individuals have additional communication challenges at times. So if you think about the 200 child level patients and then the adult patients, if you include also people who have challenges in communication in general, that's going to bring the numbers up from what I previously said. So now that we're looking at interpreting, because we have looked at these people who have a hearing loss, you are going to have to be prepared for that because no question you will encounter people like that. So how will you provide communication access to all of these individuals that you will most surely see? In general, the majority of these individuals utilize some kind of assistive listening technology so that their ability to hear things can be enhanced. Now, when they use those devices, oftentimes there's a thought that that completely mitigates the problem at hand, but that's not necessarily always the case. It can improve communication and the ability to appreciate that, but a measurement of full and 100% access to communication is not something that we know is happening at that point at all times, but that it can provide some improvement. Some of these individuals decide to use hearing aids, and it is effective for some of them. Then there's also individuals in some situations, for if there's a larger group, for example, they would request captioning services. There are some people who will ask for light indicated signals or things to be to have the sound turned up. Really, there's a wide variety of options of assistive listening technology to help people in these situations. So Stephen Snow, the previous presenter, has a program in the agency, and they work with different locations in Idaho and partner with organizations that work with senior citizens as well. And they also explain assistive hearing technology that's available. And if that's something that you would like some more information on, please feel free to contact CDHH, as they have a wide range of experience on that and a lot of expertise. So oftentimes we hear people talking about cochlear implants. And there is a belief, and we are told many times, that cochlear implants solve the problem of needing to be able to hear better. Cochlear implants are a device that are placed, that are a medical appliance in someone that has an electrical simulation of sound that can improve a person's ability to understand speech. However, it's not always something that is able to be guaranteed or always know that that's the case. There are individuals who definitely benefit from cochlear implants. It's not a solution that is 100% effective in all situations, although it can be in some. Let me just bring this forward. So some of the issues that can come up with cochlear implants that I'd just like to touch on are the fact that if there is environmental noise, a cochlear implant oftentimes, because of the way that it's set up, will filter out some of the background noise. However, if there's many people that are speaking in an environment, for example, a meeting, if something is occurring in a restaurant where there's a lot of conversation, the ability of the device to filter out other conversations or other speech does make it challenging at times for the cochlear implant users to have full understanding. And so the environment where the use does make a difference. It is optimal if you can have one person at a time speaking when there is a cochlear implant user, because it makes it easier to appreciate what the person is saying. The other important point is that people oftentimes are not wearing their implants. People take off their implants to take a shower. There are times throughout their day where they do not use the cochlear implants. And so at those moments, they are completely unable to hear many times. Something else to think about in terms of cochlear implants is really the way that sound is processed in the brain actually is different than without devices. And because of that, there is a great deal of training necessary to be able to decode all of the stimuli received through the device and through the implant. There is a great deal of articulation and speech therapy that often is needed in concert with the use of CIs, and there are many people who feel that that is certainly worth the time invested into it. There are others, many that we are personally aware of, that have had implants and who have told us over time that they had wished that they would have been able to have more time exposed to academic subjects in the classroom, such as science or English. But instead, their time was spent on other kinds of training, which left them at a loss and a disadvantage in terms of keeping up academically. Many times they weren't able to participate in extracurricular activities or even to socialize with their friends because the speech therapy and other kinds of training was prioritized. It is a trade-off that people have to be aware of. And it is what it is, for better or worse. Another point is that cochlear implants are quite expensive. They range between $30,000 to $50,000 for a unilateral implant. If it's a bilateral implant, figures have been quoted as much as $100,000, and certainly more than, say, another expense in life, like a car or something like that. Now, if a person had an implant and then later on the device was damaged, What does happen at times is that they are not able to replace the technology until it falls in line with the schedule of replacement provided by the insurance company. So if it is the case that they have to do that, sometimes they're at a disadvantage too. And there is limitations sometimes to the amount of training or speech therapy that insurance will cover. And then there are the supplies, the consumable supplies, such as batteries, that go along with those devices that also sometimes are not reimbursed. And so there are costs associated with those as well. So that's something that also should be considered when someone's deciding, especially families, about whether or not it's going to be something that's workable. And many times people have those expenses taken care of for them when they're younger, but then as they become adults or young adults, their ability to afford something like that is compromised until they come to a better position in life. And so it's that time in there when sometimes it is more challenging, and that should be considered as well. Not everyone is eligible for implantation for a variety of reasons. And also, sometimes they are ineffective for certain individuals. One of the most concerning aspects to us is the fact that cochlear implant manufacturers and those health professionals describe the benefits to parents and oftentimes make guarantees of success of the benefit of that procedure, which at the time sounds very impressive. And if it were true, it would be wonderful. And it would be great to see the numbers and statistics that support those statements. So for example, even a child as young as 6 months, if we had complete longitudinal data about whether or not the surgery was successful, as well as the training, and then what we could expect, and have benchmarking in terms of what's happening in classroom environments, when it works. But that information is not publicly available. We don't know what implant recipients have in terms of expectations for percentages of success of understanding. The cochlear implant manufacturers, who are approved by the Food and Drug Administration, they have had data that has been collected all along. Requests have been made to share that data with members of the public, and it has been repeatedly denied. So, of course, there is an underlying mistrust and suspicion of the fact that although people announce very successful outcomes, we don't know what the long-term outcomes are of that because we don't have the data available to us. Deaf individuals have more of an opportunity to see many recipients of these devices, and we have seen many failures. But as far as the data and the statistics that back that up either way, there isn't the kind of ability to get access to that. And really, more studies need to be done to get that data out there. I also want to clarify some information about the deaf community. Oftentimes, we hear it said that the deaf community is against cochlear implantation. And is that the case? It is absolutely not. We are not against that. I even personally have friends that have a cochlear implant. We know of people who have benefited from that significantly, and we recognize that, yes, it is very helpful in some cases for some individuals. What we're left with, though, is a concern, and not just one, but several. What we are concerned about is the fact that there is what we would call the first contact group. When parents have a child who is identified with a hearing loss, the first contact that they have is with a healthcare professional, oftentimes a physician, a clinician, Sometimes there is a different kind of expert. So, for example, in the Idaho educational system, there's an outreach specialist sometimes. Sometimes those are the point of first contact. And so what we hear again and again is that parents are being told cochlear implants are wonderful. It's the thing that's best for them. It will work the best. And so we have parents that assume that an implant is going to completely solve or fix the problem. And that's not necessarily the case. It does require quite an investment of time, effort, and many times it's not something that can be carried through. There's also another concern that, frankly, we have heard that there are parents that have had discussions and already have experiences with the deaf community. Maybe, for example, these are parents who have adopted a child who is deaf, and they have a lot of information that has been given to them that is frankly in error. And when they tell us this information, we decide to, we may decide to ask and find out where they're getting the information from and how that's getting passed on. But when we try to clarify it, we're given a different answer. So there could be a parent of a deaf child, and they get a different answer than a parent, a hearing parent of a deaf child. So it's interesting that we see this different information depending on who the parent is and what their role is within the deaf community as well, whether they have experience, whether they are deaf themselves, those sorts of things. There are healthcare professionals and therapists who really have an attitude of knowing what is best and knowing that they are the ones that, quote unquote, have the answer for this, quote unquote, problem. I know how to solve this 100%. And really, that is completely arrogant. The assumption that you have this solution for 100% of the people, 100% of the time, it is a level of arrogance that is incomprehensible in some ways. Another concern is the fact that people receive even bilateral implants and then they are sent off to experience that on their own. Maybe they have 1 year of speech therapy and that's all they're eligible to receive. And then they say, good luck, you can move on from there. They don't have that kind of continuum of care. And the people that do that oftentimes don't see the long-term success or failure of the methods that they are using to give people these services. But we see it over the course of many years as members of the deaf community. There's information that we have access to that we can share with professionals. And we, without being biased, without discriminating against TIs, with looking at it as a tool, we have so much that we are able to offer in terms of perspective. It would be wonderful to be able to work together in that regard, to be able to increase the life standard and the quality of life of people who have these devices and these experiences. There are many people that we know of that have implants or other types of assistive technology. Within that large group of people, there still is a need for access, even with all of the devices or all of the technology available. Many times, there are people who say, well, they can read lips or they can write, or there is somebody maybe who will type and put things on a screen to give additional information to meet some of those access needs. And those are things that people have grown up using. So, for example, the thumb up, middle thumb system that Steve Snow spoke of before, just that short writing, how are you? Are you feeling any pain? This abbreviated form of communication that requires only yes, no answers, or where does it hurt? Point. That kind of communication does not allow for full expression, does not allow for interaction. And for example, if someone goes to the dentist, and if I've gone and I don't have any specific concerns, but it's just an appointment that I go in to have a teeth cleaning, for example, and the dentist is there and says, oh, we don't need to have an interpreter, or I say I don't have any concerns, and then we have a teeth cleaning. But maybe they say that they don't need an interpreter, but I'm the one who has the experience. I know my situation. So if I make a request for an interpreter, it means that I need to have a more in-depth conversation. There are times that isn't necessary, but when I make that request, it's important. So for example, people like me and also Stephen Snow would like to have an interpreter available in those kinds of situations so that there wouldn't be an assumption that communication is going to be happening another way. If someone asks for an interpreter, it means that they know that they're going to need to have an in-depth conversation. Maybe they want to talk about treatment. Maybe they want to clarify some of the more nuanced questions that they need to ask. There's sometimes questions about abuse that providers ask. Now, can you imagine asking questions like that in writing, where you had a patient write and say, my dad hits me? And then the provider would ask the mom, does the dad hit? And then get an answer of spanking. But that's not what that child means. They're talking about being abused. So that written communication is changing the whole meaning. So when people ask for an interpreter, there's a reason that they want one, and there's a reason that it's necessary. I want to bring up another point about interpreting and that process. Oftentimes people assume that the process of interpreting is a word for word rendering. So we have a famous sentence here: a quick brown fox jumps over the lazy dog. And then below, we have a word by word translation of that. And perhaps some of you in the audience know Spanish. And when you read that sentence, you will know that it is rendered incorrectly, that the translation is not right, but rather the bottom sentence, which I hope is the right one. It could be wrong because of Google Translate, but the full sentence at the bottom could be better, but still other things have to be included. Interpreting also includes cultural aspects. It includes social norms that have to be represented in the interpretation. Interpreters must be content experts, and especially in the area of healthcare and interpreting for healthcare situations. And frankly, not all signers, and many of these people don't have training, so they are not interpreters that should be used in the medical field, in medical settings. And that's the case for other interpreters that don't have specialized knowledge. There's specific terminology that has to be understood. An example that I can use is somebody says, there's a word bus, and it can mean the large vehicle used for transportation. But then there's also a serial bus, where if somebody does not know the difference between those two, they will get a completely different picture about what a bus is in a situation. Interpreters also have many assumptions that they have to make with clients. Now, clients come to us, they have history, they have background. And they come with information about medical terminology or not. One has to determine whether or not they have that information, if it's enough to give them the understanding to follow a treatment plan, for example. And when you think about what will work with the general population, when there's an interpreted interaction, there has to be specific training to be able to do that accurately. Let me move ahead here. Hang on just a second. I just used the example of a word by word translation or rendering, but American Sign Language, typically used by many members of the deaf community, is highly differentiated from spoken language. It has its own grammar, it has its own syntax, it has its own features of language. And I want to quickly just give you a little primer on this prepositions. So in, out, and through. We're going to talk about those for just a minute as a way of example. ASL per se doesn't have those specific lexical items. Instead, we use space. We set up items in space. Here's a building, here's a tree. Then you can show the side of something, the top of something on top of it. So it's the use of space and the use of visual information that actually makes a preposition. So all of the space that's available is something that we make use of to convey information. We have oftentimes sense of humor. That movie, The Matrix, in that very where they had that scene where they moved in slow motion and the bullets were flying across. You can see the cinematic ability of ASL to explain it. So we also have another joke where there's a deaf person who can be involved in that creative team, if that were the case. For so many years, for such a long time, we've been able to tell those stories because we do that cinematic use of language. We already have that special effect in our language. It's something that we possess and are able to use. And it's an awesome and amazing language, American Sign Language. There could be other movies that could be added if people would learn to be able to express things the same way that we're able to. So I want to emphasize some other points about the fact of world knowledge and development of information. All scientists have agreed that babies, when they are born, that it's so important for early exposure to language, to sound, to concepts, to information, and that acquisition process is so important and is what leads to fluent language. When people have fluent language use, it means that they're able to analyze, to use critical thinking. They have skills to be able to make associations. All of that gives way to giving more and more information and potential in someone's life. Sadly, for those people who have hearing loss prior to the age of 5, many of them, continuing throughout their lifetime, because of the lack of exposure at a young age, experience language deprivation. Language deprivation has effects on the ability to remember things, on the ability to be creative, on the ability of the brain to work properly. And it's proven that the ability to make associations and to hypothesize is diminished, that it diminishes cognitive capacity. And so, because of the fact that many people who do experience language deprivation, there's a reason for that. It's because of the situation at home. Over 90% of fathers in homes with children with hearing loss do not communicate with their deaf child. And a very large number of mothers who communicate with their deaf child do so in a survival mode, giving commands, go to bed, go take a bath, come over here, eat. So just survival communication, go mow the lawn. And that kind of communication does not have the interchange of natural language, doesn't offer options on how to solve problems or build information on how to do many different things. Also, the educational situation can contribute to language deprivation, the opportunities that children receive. Here's a quote that I have. It says, most, if not all, of our students come in to the school with little or no language. Now, I want to clarify that quote in some ways. We're assuming that it's talking about kindergarteners to age 5, and the case is that's not what that quote is about. This quote is somebody who's talking about children of all ages when they come into this school. These are children that go to their local school first, their home school, and then they fail in these environments. Sometimes they're in the 3rd or 4th environment. And then finally in a high school, they're able to come in and have access to communication, but they have little to no language at that time. Personally, our next presenter, Professor Radford and Steve Snow and I have all been blessed that we have had family members, all of us, that have signed since a very young age. We have all been able to have communication access in our homes. And all of our parents were able to understand the needs that we had in order to make sure that those were satisfied. And if we had frustration, we were able to express that frustration so that the situations around us could change. But the point I'm trying to make is that studies have shown that children whose parents who are deaf, these are deaf children of deaf parents, and who have been tested at a range of ages, their language development is on par with their hearing counterparts, with hearing children of hearing parents. Now, for the 3 of us, we had parents and we had family members who were able to sign. Now, Steve Snow had a deaf brother, but our families were hearing, but the members of our family signed. And still, that was a situation where it ended up that we had access to communication that was on par. Dr. Radford's specific Professor Radford's specific passion does focus on education and language deprivation and meeting the language needs of children. I want to emphasize that our society has failed many deaf people. It is a societal failure that their access to health information and health literacy is terrible. And it is such a tragedy. And the reason that that's happened is because they haven't had access, and then they ask for an interpreter, and those interpreters are expensive, yes, but we're talking about someone's health, and they need it for their health. Interpreters know how and have had the training to be able to help with that communication. They're communicative experts. I want to close with some information about certified deaf interpreters. So we have certified hearing interpreters, who are individuals who can hear English and interpret it into sign language. Those people we call in our industry certified hearing interpreters, or CHIs. Those people have specific training and knowledge to interpret, but there are situations where they are not the best fit for a particular patient. There are many patients who need specialist interpreters, who need really all certified deaf interpreters are native signers, have grown up using that language in extensive environments, socializing, talking with, understanding the frustrations of our people. We understand the linguistic needs, and we know with specialized knowledge how to accommodate what they need us to in order to be able to understand. It's very similar to medical practitioners who are generalists, and then you get referred to a specialist when it's beyond the scope of their practice. It is the same thing happens when CHIs refer clients to CDIs. And you can see here that you would have two interpreters in this picture. One interpreter is providing the services for the doctor and the health professional. And then you have someone who is talking specifically to the patient. Now, I do understand that there is more cost involved in that when you have that specialist interpreter. It's a second interpreter. However, we have people that will say, so my visit fee, the health professionals will say, the visit fee that I would earn at this is not enough to afford the cost of the two interpreters, that it's too expensive and that it's an undue hardship. So the Americans with Disabilities Act, the law, requires that people are provided with accessible communication. The word that's used is reasonable accommodation. And medical providers oftentimes will capitalize on that word and say that it's not reasonable in that. But deaf people have had the struggle and the frustration and then have ended up not bothering receiving health care at all. That word, undue hardship, that specific phrase, does not apply to health providers. That phrase in the law only applies to employers when they are going to hire a disabled individual. Case after case in the United States regarding the ADA has been cases has been won when that was the case, that it wasn't an undue hardship. It does not qualify under that. The bottom line is, if somebody says I can't afford interpreter services, not being able to, quote unquote, afford interpreter services cannot be used as a way to say that it's an unreasonable or an undue hardship. That's not the case. So the problem is that the clinic is not allocating enough set-aside expenses to plan for providing accommodations for patients. That should be part of a clinic budget. Just like salaries are paid for and other expenses are met, that is another expense. If you can't pay that, you can't pay the other things. So within the disability community, we oftentimes make the suggestion that all offices, all service providers, all places of accommodation should be setting aside 2 to 5% of their budget to be able to achieve accommodation for all of their patients. So here in the Treasure Valley, it might be that there is more patients. So they would go with the 5% figure. Perhaps in a more rural area where there isn't as many people that are disabled, if it's in that area, you could go with a 2% figure. But the point is if you are not meeting the needs of the deaf person, it's not a budget problem. It's something that you need to be taking care of in terms of accommodation. So the IRS provides specific incentives, and I know I'm almost out of time and probably am over, but during the Q&A, I'm happy to explain more if you're interested in specific tax credits that are available to those who provide accommodations. There's also write-offs that are available, and then there's also reimbursements through Medicaid or Medicare. And here's some more information on what is available. So the law was established to make it so that it is more affordable to provide these kinds of accommodations. And so it is my fervent prayer that you would remember what Steve Snow said, that you would remember the frustrations experienced by deaf patients in situations, and that it's not just them. Do not ignore their need for interpreters. They are people that need the specialist interpreters as well. Make sure that this is available in your offices, wherever you work in the future. Set aside that money for accommodations so that when you have patients that come to you that need an interpreter, that the budget will be ready and you will be able to accommodate them. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you. That is a very passionate plea and gave some very good information, both about the history of interpreting the need for interpreters, and how that works. So we will save any questions. If Stephen wants to come back on, we do have one question. Otherwise, we'll save it for the panel.
Yes. Oh, maybe one or two questions would be okay. I don't want to run too far over on time, but yes, fine.
So we had one question come in. It says, I have seen and read about hearing families only seeking advice from the medical side, and they are completely ignorant to the deaf community and the rich culture behind it. How can we expose them to the right information? For example, that CIs aren't for everyone, that it's not going to fix everything, and that whether or not their child gets a cochlear implant, they still need both languages.
Great. Yes. Okay. As the deaf community, the approach and philosophy that we have is, why would it be that someone would only select one option? Why, once you give someone a hammer, everything that they see becomes a nail? Why not give people an entire toolbox of choices so that whatever is appropriate in the situation, that tool will be available for them? So yes, our deaf community strongly bases our experiences on what we've seen with cochlear implant users, and also through the research that has shown that there are people that have implants, and when they receive speech therapy at the same time, that we can take a look at those people who have exposure to sign language as opposed to those who only have exposure to spoken language. But those people who have exposure to both sign language and spoken language, their understanding and comprehension is increased. There is research and there is information available on that would highly promote the use of all the tools available to any child, and that the use of all tools does not diminish their ability to learn to speak. And so, in this sort of medical situation, when you're thinking about young children between 2 to 8 years of age, it is a wonderful idea to include an interpreter so that the interpreter can also provide information. Because by the time a child reaches middle school to high school age, they will start understanding when they can and can't do something. And perhaps at that point, they say, okay, at a doctor's office, I don't need the services of an interpreter and can make an educated decision. But if it's somebody that has an accent, or if it's a situation where perhaps they're in a great deal of pain, they're not able to focus, or something like that, then at that point, they would say, please get an interpreter. I'm in pain. You know, that it's hard to pay attention auditorially when they're in such pain. And again, when a person asks, there's a reason that they're asking for that service. Don't fight to avoid that. Don't block the access.
Well, again, thank you very much. And we will take another break. And you'll have another poll show up to our participants, and we will start again at 3 o'clock. All right. So wanted to thank Jill for her thoughts and her comments. And I think she was able to wrap things very well for us. So one of the first questions, and I'll take this one, is how do we reach you? And so at the end of our conference today, we will send out contact information, and we'll make sure that on your the agenda, conference agenda, we'll have email addresses on there as well. So, and there are a couple of thank yous in the Q&A that I wanted to recognize. So one question is, how can interpreters make an impact for deaf and hard of hearing students and their right to full access, especially for kids who may not have that language background and don't know how to access through an interpreter? Jill, would you like to take that question?
I'm going to read the question in English to ensure that I'm addressing all of it, if you'll give me just a moment. I'm going to give you my utopian answer with Stephen Stubbs here, as well as our qualified interpreters. My perfect vision of education would be to have both a certified hearing interpreter as well as a certified deaf interpreter in a classroom with deaf kids the whole way through. So that's a utopian answer. It's not realistic necessarily. But I know that the role of an educational interpreter is critical, and interpreters need to possess cultural knowledge. That's true both of educational as well as community interpreters. Students who are deaf and hard of hearing in a classroom often struggle with accessing full information and all of the culturally rich information in the educational setting. An educational interpreter is part of the individual education plan team, the group that develops the IEP and recognizes what's necessary to help students fully develop and thrive. Educational interpreters have a role to provide input as an expert in the classroom for educational settings. So that's my thoughts on it.
I'd be glad to add to that. When we look at the word full access in all caps, when I think about that, I think about the classroom environment with a student sitting and an interpreter there. Now, there is passing periods where students have these opportunities to find out what they've done over the weekend, and a deaf student may not have that. People communicate in the cafeteria, and the student would not have that full inclusion. Often, the IEP team, the Individualized Education Plan team, just focuses on this academic and classroom environment. But what they fail to consider is the other activities, the between classes, the cafeteria, the interactions with the friends and after school extracurricular activities. So
Yes.
when we're talking about full inclusion, I'm so thankful that I had my experience at the residential school for the deaf. I wasn't in Idaho, I was in another state. However, when I was done with class, I could talk with my peers, make plans, joke with them, talk to them in the cafeteria. And really, it was just one big wild party all the time. But I was involved after school in sports. And so I had this opportunity to develop relationships, to learn problem solving skills, to develop a sense of self identity, all of those other things that when you think of the word full inclusion, do they really mean full inclusion or do they just mean inclusion in the classroom?
Thank you. Snow.
Absolutely. There are two things that I would like to add to that as well. It's important that educational interpreters set aside their pride and that they attend workshops and they continue to hone in on their skills.
Absolutely.
Unfortunately, what we see is that many educational interpreters feel that they are competent enough and they don't participate in trainings and they're not involved in the community. And secondly, Stephen Stubbs mentioned the word full access. And it's scary but true. In Idaho, the way that we qualify an educational interpreter is through the Educational Performance Assessment, or the EIPA. And that minimum score to work in the state of Idaho is a 3.5 on that assessment. And that is equivalent to 60% of the message, which means that the interpreter is listening to 100% and only interpreting 60% of the message. And do we consider that acceptable? Meaning that our deaf students are only having access to 60% of their education. If we think about it, 60% isn't a full access to education. Even a 4.0 is still not at that 100% accessible level. It's impossible for a student to be able to fully access their education through a sign language interpreter. They can get close, but it will never be 100%. It's imperative that educational interpreters analyze themselves and that they be honest with themselves about their skill level. Instead of pushing those concerns aside, if they're concerned in some areas, they should be honest and upfront, and they may need to step aside in some situations and have someone else step in to interpret. Many interpreters say that they are good enough and they don't take the time to analyze themselves, so it's imperative that educational interpreters do that.
And that applies to medical interpreters as well. Any situation, really, any type of interpreter, not only educational. Every interpreter needs to know that when they are walking in to an appointment. And I can think how often interpreters may be thinking like, ooh, that's me or that's me. But for a deaf person to have full access, that's not realistic unless the person they're talking to is also using sign language.
So along those lines, what is the best way to establish or reestablish trust with a deaf client when an interpretation has not gone smoothly? And this is from an interpreting student.
I can take a stab at that. That is an issue that we have in one of our classes, in an ethics class, that we focus on really that sort of thing for an entire semester. And it's still just scratching the surface, but really there's two ways to look at it. You can think about the perspective with whether or not the interpreter is transparent with the deaf client. So if they've arrived at an appointment and they say that I'm a novice interpreter or I'm new, and they try to work things out, and they say, if I'm not going to be okay, just let me know and we'll reschedule. You can take a look at that way. Or also, we can take a look at what the deaf person needs. Perhaps it's an emotionally charged appointment, and they know that that interpreter is not appropriate for that situation. But there are those situations that are not that sort. There's a range of situations, and there's a range of interpreters, and sometimes they're layered and they can overlap. One has to think about how to solve that, and it can be discussed at length, but we do actually discuss that for those sorts of things for an entire semester with interpreters.
I'd also want to say in regards to trust, or we're still on that question, correct?
Yes.
Just in regards to trust, I would say that first impressions are long lasting.
Yes.
So when that trust is lost, I would say good luck trying to earn that back. It's very difficult to do. And the deaf community is very forgiving, but it's something that you all should keep in mind, that if that trust is broken and if you have been negligent with that, it's really hard to regain that. We know that interpreters are human, and we will always consider that. There are some situations that are highly sensitive, though, and if an interpreter does come in and breaks that trust, it's very difficult to earn that back. So I would say do it right the first time. Don't make that mistake.
Yes.
I have something else. I saw another question that was in regards to music, a person who had said that they were a music educator. And I thought that might be, they were talking about accommodating deaf and hard of hearing students. I have to tell you, there are many deaf people who love music. Indeed, there are.
I'm one of them. I love it.
Especially, well, except me. I don't know. I can't, well, okay, no, not me. But
I love it.
There are people who do.
Jill's not normal. Just ignore that.
Anything else you want to add about how, let's see where that question went. How to include those that want to experience music in the classroom?
No, I want to go first, not me, or not Steve. I want to go first. Okay, yep. So in American Sign Language, it incorporates both rhythm and rhyme. Many people don't realize that American Sign Language can incorporate the concept of a beat or of rhythm, that those things are already a part of the language when well done. So if you find someone who is a qualified language model, who is doing it well, whether it's music or poetry, there's so many videos that are available now that you're able to show and that you can see authentic native signers, and they are producing music from American Sign Language, not an interpretation of English music for people who can hear or other languages for people who can hear, but rather deaf poetry, deaf rhythm. Many schools think, oh, we should include sign language. It's so pretty. It'll be very pretty for this song. I would say be careful with that. It is easy to misunderstand how to incorporate signs. Sometimes they're applied incorrectly to English lyrics. So if the goal is just make it a pretty performance, I would caution people against that. So as somebody who is a native signer, I would say bring in somebody who knows ASL. Don't rely on videos for vocabulary.
Absolutely. Another resource that could be used for students or for teachers is called DPAN, DPAN, and that can be found on their website or on YouTube. And they have several videos of music in American Sign Language. One individual, his name is Sean Forbes. I'm not necessarily his biggest fan, but I know he's very popular in that realm. And he makes many videos that are very visually appealing, that incorporate those sounds in a visual way. And I wouldn't say many, but some individuals really like that. So that's another option to incorporate music in a visual way.
Thank you. All right, I have one for you, Steve Snow. From earlier, thanking you for your research and the work that went into that. And this individual loves the idea of diversity in the medical field. However, they have witnessed and know of many deaf individuals who have tried to complete a medical program. So as the student, a medical program, but the amount of discrimination they face in these programs is a huge obstacle. So how do we educate the educators?
Absolutely, that's a great question. One of my good friends, Zach Featherstone, he is well recognized nationally for his case of discrimination when he was in medical school. And the National Association of the Deaf actually sued that medical school and won that case. At that point, Dr. Featherstone decided to transfer schools and completed his training there. There are many deaf individuals, like this person asked, that have experienced that and have experienced discrimination to the point where they have not finished. From what I have heard, even after they have submitted a complaint of discrimination, they're often neglected and excused from that program, saying that they don't qualify to finish. There are quite a few deaf students who are currently in the process of going through medical school, so it's promising, but there definitely needs to be more awareness and more instruction for those educators. Unfortunately, autism is rampant in the medical field and in that culture. And what that means is that they are focused on the ear only instead of on the person as an individual. I've noticed some cultural shifts and some minute changes, and I'm hoping that we continue to see that. There are so many competent deaf individuals who can be successful if they choose to enter the medical field. And who knows, one day they could even find cures for horrific diseases, but we need to be able to give them the opportunity to become a doctor first.
If I could chime in with that, we've talked about autism. Doctors and medical professionals often suffer from ableism. They see everything as something broken that must be fixed. I would encourage them to look at it through a different framework. Just look at multiple abilities. So instead of looking at what people cannot do, focus on what they are able to do. When people go in to see a medical professional, they come in with skills, with knowledge, with ability. They aren't coming in as something broken to be fixed. Zach Featherstone's approach in his case are something that the deaf community really celebrated. The deaf community, it feels like one of our own is now in the field that we could get full access. I think, as Steve said, change is coming. You will see a tidal wave of change.
Absolutely. For our participants today that are entering the medical field, I would encourage you to do your part. We can partner together to make that change. Instead of just taking today as just some neat information, you can take this on and apply it to the medical field.
Yes. Often parents meet a doctor as one of their first professionals after they find out that they have a child who's deaf and hard of hearing. They don't know where to find deaf adults, and that's not who they go to first. They trust the medical providers, and so they'll go to the doctor or audiologist and say, hey, I have this deaf kid. What can I do? And I think that this is where medical providers can really establish a rapport with the deaf community, and we're seeing that happen more and more. That change is coming.
So one last comment here. Two. One is a thank you for bringing up the idea of 60% with the EIPA. And the other is that hopefully this is the tipping point. And just a big thank you for sharing all of this vital information. And so with that, I'll give a couple of concluding remarks. And so if I'm going to share my screen again, if our panelists want to turn off their videos, thank you again so very much. And I